30 years.
Launched to represent the views of the British people.
To go where other broadcasters refuse to go.
How did you find out about the story in the first place?
Launched with one aim.
To be the fearless champion of Britain.
It's an absolutely fantastic atmosphere here.
This is GB News.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening. The Conservative government say they want a ban on sex education and relationship advice for kids at primary school. Yet, wasn't it them that brought this in 2020? Are they being hypocrites? Maybe. But the subject matters. What is the appropriate age? 50 MPs signed a letter to say we should take Palestinian refugees. But wouldn't that just mean a whole load of pro-Hamas people coming into Britain? And today, we begin this programme's countdown to the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and we ask the question, why do so few British youngsters seem to know what really happened? But before all of that, let's get the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Nigel, thank you and good evening. The top stories from the GB Newsroom. Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico is in a critical condition after he was shot following a government meeting in Handlover outside the capital, Bratislava. Officials could be seen bundling the Prime Minister into a car shortly after several shots were heard hitting Mr Fico in the abdomen. He was then airlifted to hospital, where his condition is now life-threatening. One man has now been detained by authorities. The country's president condemned the assassination attempt, describing it as a brutal attack. Mr Fico won power for a fourth time last October and has implemented more pro-Russian policies. He's pledged to stop military support for Ukraine and threatened to veto the country's membership in NATO. In other news, emergency measures are now in place across England to deal with overcrowded prisons. It means defendants in police custody will remain there and won't be transferred to courts for bail hearings. The Labour leader used today's Prime Minister's questions to reference a report saying high-risk prisoners are being let out up to 70 days early without sufficient planning. New proposals could see schools in England banned from teaching students about gender identity. The government's review would also see all sex education halted for children under the age of 9. The Prime Minister ordered the review last year amid concern some children were being exposed to inappropriate content. Reports suggest parents will be provided samples of sex education content before lessons take place. Police could make more use of existing stop-and-search powers as part of new measures to tackle knife crime. The searches were curbed a decade ago by then Home Secretary Theresa May after it was found minorities were being disproportionately targeted. £3.5 million will be invested into developing new technology, which could help police detect suspects carrying knives by scanning them from a distance. And if you've ever found yourself stuck on hold, how about waiting 800 years? Now, that is just how long people in Britain spent waiting to talk to the taxman last year. A damning report from the government spending watchdog found taxpayers were on hold to HMRC for around 7 million hours in that tax year. It was less than half that time before the COVID pandemic. Fewer calls are now being answered, and those who do manage to get through spend longer on the phone amid what's being called a declining spiral of customer service. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Nigel.
Lockdown was a real shock to many parents. You see, when your kids go to school from the age of about 7 to 18, and when they come home, you say, darling, how was your day? What did you learn today? They say nothing. It's as if kids never want to tell their parents what they've been taught or not been taught at school. It's their own little private secret world. But with lockdown, suddenly kids of all ages were in the kitchen or in their bedrooms, logged on, and mums and dads who were there locked down as well could hear what they were being taught. And there were many, many cases. I know of some close to me where parents were genuinely shocked at some of the things their kids were being taught because they thought it was being done inappropriately. Now, the government comes out overnight and says, we will stop sex and relationship education for kids at primary school. We think that up until that age of at least 9 or 10, 11, it's wrong for this to be done. And it's ironic, really, because it was this government who made it compulsory in primary schools back in September 2020. But as with so many things, the Conservatives will fight the next election pretending that everything that happened in the last 14 years wasn't really them. But that's not really the point here. If we wanted to talk about hypocrisy of Conservative statements, we'd never achieve anything. I want to get to a more fundamental point. What is the appropriate age to teach kids about relationships? To teach kids that not everybody has a male father, a female mother. There are homosexual relationships. There are other choices that some adults make. And what is the right age to talk about sex education and where we come from? Because kids ask that question from the age of 5, 6, 7, whatever it may be. And how do you do it? And I think there's little doubt that there are some schools that have been teaching very inappropriate material. So my question, and this is one of those questions that perhaps doesn't have a straightforward answer because it depends how the subject's handled, but it does really matter. What is the appropriate age for relationships and, you know, for sex and where we come from? What is the appropriate age for this stuff to start to be taught? Let me know what you think. Farage@gbnews.com. I'm joined in the studio by Chloe Abbott, founder and director of Education Choices magazine, and down the line by Emma Hardy, mother and campaigner. Chloe, let's start with you. As I say, this is not one of those absolutely black and white issues of what is right, what is wrong. What we do know is that there have been cases in schools of wholly inappropriate material being put in front of kids of 6 or 7 years old. How do you think we should deal with this issue?
I think from our perspective, and obviously we have done a number of interviews with leading heads like Nick Hewlett from St Dunstan's, who have a lot of concerns surrounding the Children's Commission report in 2023, when it stated actually that 27% of children by the age of 11 have come across some form of pornography online. Mm-hmm. And I think that further to that, there are concerns amongst parents about perhaps children being allowed to be children, and where does education step in and what's the right time? The government guidelines really are very open. For the primary curriculum to date, since you said 2020, the primary curriculum is very much about healthy relationships, having relationships. And then year 6, which probably to you won't mean much, but to teachers, they all know that come 10, 11, that's when obviously puberty and adolescence and human biology.
So that's the right time, is it?
And
10 or 11?
Today, I think, I haven't got examples of the poor examples, but to date, that is fairly standard in the majority of schools.
And there will be schools, and we've heard cases where very inappropriate material was shown to young children. That should, I mean, in a sense, that should be a disciplinary matter, shouldn't it?
That's something I just couldn't comment on.
No.
I haven't.
But given that kids leave primary school normally at 11, the government overnight, having U-turned on its previous advice, is now saying there should be no sex education for 11-year-olds.
Isn't it 9-year-olds?
Well, is it 9? Is it 10?
It's not obviously to date been released, but
you think sort of 9, 10,
certainly
11?
the BBC News are reporting it's going to be 9-year-olds.
OK, but I get from what you're saying, you think 9 or 10 is about the right age.
I think that in the majority of cases, at that point, they're about to leave. They're going to then go on to a senior school setting in the majority with older kids. Yeah. And obviously, they're going to be starting to change themselves. Yeah. But I would also make it clear in the government guidelines, If parents are not happy, it's very explicit on this, and do not wish their children to attend, they do not have to, and that is made very clear.
I know, but the problem is parents, and I said this at the start of my talk, that, you know, busy parents, both working, and they ask the kid, how was the day, what did you learn? And kids just sort of don't want to tell their parents what's happened. It's often quite difficult for parents to know at what point kids are being taught.
The policy, again, in the government guidelines, school policies, and it's down to each individual school, should always be made very clear to parents, so that that's the first thing. What is going to be taught should be available to them. But the suggestion to date, from what we know, is that schools do send letters out and alert parents, and possibly even invite the parents in if the parents have concerns, and talk to them so that they can navigate a path that works for everyone.
So, on balance, again, it's about each school and how it's done, and we know that. On balance, has what's been said today, is it about right?
I think that, to be honest, from what I've heard so far, I think that obviously healthy relationships and mummies and daddies and kind of all of that was being taught. But certainly anything sexual, sex education, gender identity, anything like that, that's not ever suggested in a primary school setting, particularly unless it needed to be addressed. That comes in the secondary education criteria.
So you're really advising a fairly cautionary approach to the way in which this is done. I'm joined down the line by Emma Hardy, mother and campaigner. And I know, Emma, you have had you have had your concerns in the past about some of the material that's been put in front of quite young children.
Yes, definitely. From primary school right the way through to secondary school, yes.
Give us the examples, because today we're predominantly talking about primary schools. We're talking about age appropriateness. Just give us your particular case study with primary schools.
So our experience was that gender ideology is being taught to children, certainly from year 5. And that includes the idea that you can be a boy, a girl, or neither, which is obviously incredibly confusing and incorrect.
Well, I mean, there are different opinions on that, but I understand what you're saying. So you're basically, I mean, look, at some point, you know, kids as they grow up need to be taught that there are differences and people make different choices, as they always have done, and that we should be teaching kids that we, you know, should love and respect people regardless of the choices they make. But this is all about what's appropriate. So you're saying that this sort of thing is being taught to kids far too young, and it's confusing them.
So the idea that a primary school child can understand that this is a contested belief, that people have an innate gendered soul, and that we all have one, and it may or may not match your biological sex, that in itself is far too complex for a primary school age child to understand. So that the messages that these very young children take home are that you can literally be whatever you want to be, and that all forms of discrimination are wrong. So those are some two big red flags for me.
Okay, and just let me ask you, Emma, how do you think we should approach the issue of gay relationships?
So obviously relationships are a part of what you've been talking about there, and there are same-sex parents and same-sex families, and that is a part of life, and that's absolutely something that should be discussed at school. I don't have a problem with discussing families come in different shapes and sizes, but as far as talking about people's sexual preferences, I'm not sure that that's really relevant at primary school.
OK, so let me ask you, Emma, what age do you think it would be appropriate to begin to have these kind of difficult conversations?
I think sex education, biology, I think towards the end of primary school, you could discuss the biological nature of sex. What we've started to see is something that's more akin to your sexual preferences, rather than just the reproduction and the scientific aspect of sex. I think that's really what we should be focusing on at that age.
And you've written a book about all of this.
I haven't written a book, but my daughter did bring home a book.
It was the
Yes, so she was at secondary school when she brought home a book from the school library, which contained subject matter that we are certainly not appropriate for such a young age, and not educational either, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that was admittedly at secondary school. Emma, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. And, you know, I mean, Emma makes the point about this book her daughter brought home, albeit that was at secondary school, and looking, to be honest with you, Chloe, at the language that's used in it, yeah, it's frankly vile. But I think actually between the two of you, you know, and she's obviously a very concerned parent, I think between the two of you there is a sort of general agreement that it's towards the end of primary school when this debate should be happening. Yeah, it's the sort of 10, 11. But prior to that, what should we be doing? Because kids are asking questions, aren't they?
I think that schools are very aware that they have a duty of care, and I think that if something arises or they become aware of something, I think that then as adults with responsibility towards those children, each situation has to be dealt with discretion and appropriately to that scenario. I think that perhaps some of the concern that people are feeling is about the addendum to what's been said, that further to that, there can be no teaching of gender identity, and there's different things being thrown around. And I think that, you know, online safety increasingly is something, you know, the Commissioner's report did say that 27% of children had...
I know. Yeah, and whatever efforts are made...
And obviously what goes on at home is one thing, but schools have to also look at the bigger picture and whatever checks and balances you put on, these things still exist. They're going to go on existing, and people will find ways around whatever restrictions we put on. Thank you for joining us. Thank you too to Emma for joining us. And actually, we got a bit of consensus there that it is, you know, towards that sort of 9, 10, 11 is probably the appropriate age to start to have some of these very difficult conversations. Rarely we get guests to agree, but there you are. Now, 50 MPs have written a letter to the Home Secretary suggesting we start to adopt refugees from Gaza. Well, I have no doubt there are a lot of people living in Gaza in very miserable conditions indeed, but I really wonder, given that so many people in Gaza support Hamas, does it really make sense for us to take Gazan refugees when their neighbours in Egypt won't take a single one?
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 p.m.
Yes, has common sense won the day at the NHS? Yes, so someone seems to have woken up and realised people are more interested in the NHS making sick people better than calling them by the correct pronoun. Health Secretary Victoria Atkins is making changes to the NHS constitution, which will see phrases like chest feeding and people with ovaries outlawed. Even Keir Starmer is getting on board.
To get the clarity, is it right or is it wrong for Rosie Duffield to say only women have a cervix?
Well, look, biologically, she, of course, is right about that.
So do you owe her an apology?
Well,
yes. Do you owe her an apology? This has been somewhat ongoing. But actually, Krista, the NHS constitution, my understanding is it has to be changed or ratified by the health sector every 10 years.
Yeah.
So it feels like this is coming more from the government and not actually coming from the NHS at all.
Oh, you mean because it's just time? It's just like, it's time to have a look at the lease sort of thing. The 10 years are up.
But it's just that also a lot of NHS leaders are kind of saying, oh, no, we should not do this, or there's going to be complications. It feels like it's not coming. It feels like the NHS is still institutionally captured, and this is the government going, finally, no, enough is enough. Sex matters.
Right, yeah. So, OK, so I said there was nothing Rishi could do. I mean, this helps, doesn't it? It's time. It's time. That was fun watching that. I'd like that to have gone on a bit longer. I think the bit I was really going to enjoy was when he did or didn't give his apology. That's what I'd like to
Well, also, I think they should have just brought Rosie Duffield in. We've got Rosie here!
Oh, fantastic. Yes, like a sort of 90s Cilla Black's.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Matthew, tonight, I'm Rosie Duff.
Yes.
I'm dry ice.
Surprise. What's the question? Has common sense prevailed?
Well,
yes, but
you say it's got... That's my fear of it.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now, for the moment, we're going to put the debate about Palestinian refugees on hold. We're waiting for our down-the-line lawyer guest. We're going to move on to another subject, and this is HMRC, who are really a very, very difficult organisation. You know, if you're just a day late paying bills, you get fined. We'll come to that and debate that in a moment. Now, we had that conversation about what is the appropriate age. I asked you to answer that question. Steve says, just leave the kids alone, echoing a Pink Floyd song. We didn't have all that rubbish and we turned out all right. Yeah, Steve, you know what, matey? When you were growing up, we didn't have mobile phones with access to all sorts of material, as Chloe pointed out more than once in our discussion just a moment ago. Beverly says, all of us used to cringe in sex education. You come into your own and find things out from friends and parents. Nothing was news to us at 13, and honestly, below that age is just sick to be discussing it. Well, actually, Beverly, you know, the two guests I had thought the age of 10 or 11 was correct. And finally, Rob says, it's nothing to do with schools. It's down to the parents to deal with the subject. Well, Rob, I think the truth is it is a bit of both. Now, switching gears back, if I can, to Palestinian refugees. A letter to the Home Secretary, the Right Honourable James Cleverly, and it's signed by 50 members of Parliament. And it says, you know, that we have to recognise the United Kingdom's historical, present and ongoing responsibility towards Palestinians in Gaza. Now, look, there are a lot of people in Gaza going through an awful time. There are many tens of millions of people all over the world going through a terrible time for all sorts of reasons. We have been incredibly generous to those who want refugee status in our country. About 500,000 people since 2016 have been granted refugee status in Britain, albeit some of them, those from Ukraine, are supposed to be on a temporary basis. But I really wonder when it comes to Gaza, and I say that because if already 46% of the established British Muslim population are, according to a recent poll, supporters of Hamas, what would that percentage be of people that come from Gaza? And I worry about integration. I worry about a group of people that come into the country with whom not only do we have nothing in common, but who support an organisation who is, from our perspective, a prescribed terrorist group. I'm joined down the line by a friend of the programme, Ivan Sampson, immigration lawyer. Ivan, it's very interesting, isn't it, that Egypt, the next-door neighbours, literally the next-door neighbours to Gaza, have refused to take any refugees. They're quite happy for aid to cross into Gaza, but they don't want any refugees from Gaza. And yet 50 of our MPs think it's a good idea. Do you see my point about the preponderance of people from Gaza that do support Hamas?
Indeed. I mean, there's an argument for that, but there's two sides to the argument. What the open letter says is that the situation in Gaza is similar to the situation in Ukraine, and it is in some ways, but it's also different in many ways. The first point to note is that we, at the British government, work closely with the Ukrainian government to set this scheme up. We haven't got a government in Gaza, in Palestine, which we can make this scheme work. And also, there was a guarantee by the Ukrainian government that they would, we could return the 174,000 Ukrainians granted temporary visas, and there's going to be no such guarantees because there's no one that can we deal with in Palestine. So it could happen that many of the people who, if such a scheme existed, could actually claim asylum when they get here. So if they did that, then we'd have to consider those claims. And as you know, there's a massive backlog. It could take several years before those claims are discussed. There's also security risk. I think that's absolutely right. There's no way of identifying those people that sympathise with Hamas and those that don't. It'll be almost an impossible task to separate those two types of people from Palestine.
Well, given that 20 years ago there was an election that took place in Gaza and that Hamas won it comfortably, and that it would appear support for the organisation has grown up to and including and after the 7th of October, the likelihood is the preponderance of those that support Hamas would be very, very high. But I take your point. You know, once someone sets foot on British soil for whatever reason, even if they cross by a small dinghy and claim asylum, we then feel we have to go through due process, don't we?
We do. We have an obligation under the Refugee Convention to consider all asylum applications. And if they have no merit, we refuse them. Problem, the Home Office hasn't got systems in place to consider applications quickly, sift out the genuine ones from those that are not genuine, and remove those that are refused asylum. And that could mean that, 174,000 Ukrainians have come, and it could mean that we could have probably similar amount, if not more, from Palestine under the scheme. Of course, they could set a quota.
Yeah, and how would we decide who from Gaza... I mean, let's say the British government gives in and says, right, we'll take 5,000 or whatever they do. How would we process, how would we decide who gets the right to come and who doesn't?
Well, we don't know what the criteria was in Ukraine. The government never published that. And so one would say that the criteria, I would imagine, was that the territory was being occupied, similar as in Gaza, by the Israelis, same situation there.
Not quite the same, but yeah, go on.
But there are differences because the occupation by Israel is in retaliation to the events of 7th of October, whereas the occupation by Russia is totally unprovoked. So there's no reason why Russia should be in Ukraine. And then there's also the complexities of how do we process it. There are no provisions in Gaza to do that. We'd have to have cooperation with the Israeli government to operate the scheme. And I'm wondering whether the Israeli government will be open to such a scheme to allow people to leave.
I don't think so.
Potentially, Hamas, members of the Hamas could potentially leave Gaza and be heading for the UK.
Absolutely. Ivan, thank you very much for shedding some light on that. Thank you very much indeed. And I have to say, I have been saying for some time, it would be a big, big mistake to take refugees from Gaza, however much we feel sorry for the innocent people there, because there are many innocent people too who are suffering so horribly. After the break, the HMRC, the people that fine us, the people that bully us, the people that threaten us, and yet they just won't pick up the phone to help us.
Evening, welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Sunny spells for many tomorrow, but there will be some heavy showers across the south. Yet again, northern Scotland may well see the highest temperatures. Low pressure dominating down to the southwest, and this weather front's provided a thicker zone of cloud across central areas. That rain from that weather front, though, is tending to peter out, as are the heavier showers we saw earlier. Just a bit of rain just returning to parts of the east coast as we go through the night. For many, it'll be a dry night, quite murky and misty on the eastern coast, and some fog is possible across parts of the south as temperatures generally drop to about 10 to 12 Celsius. Any mist and fog in the south should be clearing away, so generally out of the way by the time we get to the morning rush hour. But quite a lot of cloud across East Anglia and parts of the southeast, where there may well be 1 or 2 showers, some of that rain feeding into Lincolnshire as well. Generally a fine start for Wales, most of Northern Ireland as well, and a good part of Scotland. Again, dry and fine with sunny spells. The breeze coming in from the North Sea, so the east coast will be chilly. But again, northern Scotland in the sunshine, we'll see those temperatures really jumping up through the course of the day. It's going to stay fairly dull and cool, though, in northeast England. Some outbreaks of rain here, and we'll see a bit more rain coming into East Anglia, Lincolnshire, then across the Midlands during the afternoon. The potential for some quite heavy showers breaking out across the Midlands, southern England and South Wales. Some torrential downpours are possible. In the brighter spells in the south, 20 degrees, but the highest temperature is likely to be across parts of Scotland. In the northwest, 23, 24 is possible. Cooler on the North Sea coast with that breeze coming in, which is still around on Friday. Again, turning things misty at times. Again, on Friday, we'll watch the showers developing across parts of England and Wales especially. Again, some heavy ones are possible, but they'll be very hit and miss. A good part of the day will be dry and bright, and in the sunny spells, it'll feel pretty warm once more. Bye for now.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio, and online.
This is GB News,
Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
I think we all accept that we live and work in this country, and especially if we do well, we've got to pay tax. But we expect tax rates to be fair. We also expect the tax system to be understandable. It is not. Our tax code gets more and more complex every year. Many of us are so scared of HMRC, the fact they can put daily fines on you, they can backdate them, they can bully you, threaten you in all sorts of ways, that we hand the whole thing over to our accountants. That effectively adds a few pence onto our overall tax rate. But there are many people who simply can't afford to pay accountants, and they're trying themselves to get to the bottom of tax demands that are being made, of how they should put their returns in, and the levels, the limits are constantly changing. And they try to ring HMRC, and we'll come to that in just a moment. Well, I'm joined by Callum McGoldrick, researcher at the Taxpayers Alliance. Callum, I remember when George Osborne was Chancellor, so we're going back a bit, that the tax code in this country had hit 15,000 pages. And we were told it was the most complex, most difficult tax system in the entire world. Where is it now?
It's now at 23,000 pages. It's still the longest in the world by some distance. When we look at somewhere like Hong Kong, which has sort of a similar level of development, they make do with 300-page tax code.
Yeah.
Most other European countries have somewhere between 10 and 15,000. We're a massive outlier internationally.
23,000 pages, very, very complicated. Most people are honest, and I really mean that. Most people are honest. They want to do the right thing. They're being asked to file tax returns, etc. And so they do the obvious thing, which is ring HMRC and ask for advice. Now, I know that ringing the gas company or the electricity company, I mean, all of it. We're living in digital Britain. You often don't understand what you're being asked. It is a nightmare. But it's even, I think HMRC are the worst of a lot now, aren't they?
So, yeah, the new figure is it will take 800 years total time waiting on hold to get through to them.
Come on, that can't be true.
Well, for comparison, it means that, if that was all one person, it means Genghis Khan would have just got through to them this year.
So they just don't answer the phone?
No. So they receive roughly 75% of their calls are for people that have either suffered an error by HMRC or an error themselves. HMRC say you should go onto their website. Often people have tried that first and it just doesn't work. Their website has a 25% success rate with people on a survey of people agreeing with it. And it means that they end up having to call HMRC.
And even if you get to the website, you know, unless you're trained in tax law, it's frankly incomprehensible, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing. People want to talk to a person. It's the most complex tax code in the world, as we mentioned. People need to speak to someone that understands it in order to be able to pay their taxes on time and at the correct amount.
Now, there was some talk, wasn't there, of the Chancellor getting tough with HMRC and saying, come on, start answering your phones. And Hunt did that, I'm thinking about 3 months ago, something like that. Do we have any evidence that HMRC have listened?
Well, the Treasury's just promised them another 51 million as well, so I think maybe go after their performance before promising them more money. We see that they have proposals to shut in the afternoon, which I hear have been abandoned. But I think that's sort of a very standard base level expectation that you'd do a full working day.
And what about work from home? Is that particular problem there with HMRC?
It is massively. So with work from home, people that deal with customer service in the civil service have by far the highest expectation to work from home. Already the civil service only do about 2 days in the office, and it's often lower for those that work in customer service jobs.
And if I'm working at HMRC and let's say I'm in my 40s and I'm pretty competent and I'm middle management, I'm going to earn quite a good salary. I'm going to have a pension package which would not be impossible, frankly, if you were in the private sector. I even hear some of them get bonuses.
Yes, they do. I think we've had a report coming out about councils that shows that many of them are receiving bonuses into the triple figures. It's the public sector thing that just doesn't exist in the private sector to that degree.
How is it that a Conservative government is not, apart from saying answer the phone, how is it that a Conservative government has, frankly, virtually not lifted a finger to tackle any of this?
It's a very good question. I think there's a big problem with civil service oversight. The ministers just can't get through to them. They're unionised, they have an awful lot of power and they go on strike. They're never in the office, so the ministers never actually see them. It's very difficult to actually get through to them.
Jacob Rees-Mogg did try.
Yes.
He did try, didn't he? But he wasn't in the post very long. Has anybody else made that sort of effort?
Well, we're seeing now there's a new bill coming out. Esther McVeigh spoke about it, which will, for diversity roles, will give ministers more oversight in how the money is spent and on roles. I think that's something that should be rolled out beyond just diversity roles and into the actual running of the departments as well.
I have to say, I think Callum McGoldrick, it's a very, very depressing picture. Thank you. And, you know, the worst part of all this, folks, at home, and that is that so many people who work are now getting up earlier in the morning, getting home later at night, working more days of the week than their parents and grandparents ever had to. The working population, particularly those who are self-employed or running small businesses or even working for big corporations, are absolutely working their socks off. They're paying the highest tax burden the country has seen since 1948. They're being treated by HMRC in many cases as if they're all potential criminals. There's no one for them to talk to. It might take 800 years to get through on the phone. And yet those that administer this system are earning good money with big pensions, potential bonuses for doing, as Callum just said in many cases, just 2 days a week in the office. And people talk about divides in the country. Well, I tell you what, the divide between those that work in the private sector or work for themselves and the public sector is now simply enormous. The What the Farage moment. Over the last couple of days, I've been making a bit of noise about the WHO, the World Health Organization. Worried as I am about the upcoming pandemic treaty. Worried as I am about the complete lack of debate that has been going on in Parliament. Now, there are some little bits of good news. That is that around the world, several governments have started to raise concerns. Interestingly, Slovakia, Robert Fico, their premier, raised very strong concerns, and you may have seen on the news, he has been shot several times in the abdomen today, and we wish him well. The WHO are changing the wording of this treaty. They're changing it in a way that will make you think they don't have supremacy of law over us. Whether that is right or not is arguable, debatable. But what this treaty does do is it gives the WHO moral supremacy. It'll be them that decide whether to declare a global pandemic. It'll be them that decides what is misinformation. It'll be them that tells us what vaccines are acceptable. It'll be them that lays down the laws and what we need to do to fly to Spain on holiday or elsewhere. And I get back to the point that I made right at the start of this. I have no problem in the World Health Organization if it's there as a place that we meet, we share information, we act as an early warning system, and crucially, we share best practice in how to deal with diseases. Whichever way you cut this, the bosses at the WHO begin to have the power and the appearance of being rather like EU commissioners. Our government yesterday denied there was any potential threat to sovereignty whatsoever. Let's see what emerges in Geneva in 2 weeks' time. But there is a little bit of good news that the pressure that is being put on is beginning to bring some changes. And believe you me, I'm going to go on putting on that pressure. June the 6th, 1944. I hope all viewers of this show know what that date means. If you don't, well, it's D-Day, that most remarkable event. Remember, 2 British beaches, 2 American beaches, 1 Canadian beach. It is the 80th anniversary coming up. It will be the last occasion on which there will be significant gatherings of people who were involved in that operation. Yet, alarmingly, it appears many, many young British people simply don't know anything about it. Between now and the 6th of June, this programme is going to talk about D-Day, to educate those who don't know much about it. We're also going to have, and it starts tomorrow with a World War II veteran coming and sitting in this very chair in the studio. We'll talk about some of those personal stories, and we'll talk about why it really is important that the younger generation understands the sacrifice that went before. We're even thinking potentially about sponsoring a couple of veterans to go back to the beaches. D-Day in just a moment.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry. Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Headliners. Tomorrow's papers tonight. Every night from 11 p.m.
Let's do the Telegraph. And Iranian women are grassing up other women for wearing fitted trousers. Are there no roles left for patriarchal oppressors to actually be men, Jonathan? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, they're taking all of our hid jobs. It doesn't work.
Oh, that kind of works.
That kind of works, OK.
It's close
right.
to a joke.
The headline is, Iranian women are betraying others to morality police for wearing fitted trousers. So a hardline Iranian militia is hiring women to enforce the country's strict hijab rules, using them to spy on other women and bundle offenders into vans to be taken for interrogation. Now, this is horrible. This is just despicable theocratic tyranny where women are, helping to stomp on the rights of other women. They're despicable snitches, in my opinion. This is not good. This is not good. This is, this is really just an affront to women's rights.
Okay.
And I disagree with it.
Well, just for balance.
Yeah.
I've got to give balance, it's my job. I mean, one of the women here is saying, look, we should intimidate them so they stop going out as if it's Paris or London. And you look at Paris and London these days, Leo, cultural decline, you're like, hey, maybe they've got a point.
No, I mean, I think if you look at Paris and London, would you be able to tell the difference between that and Tehran?
That's another point. But I was making, and I deplore it and disavow it.
But yeah, basically, women love judging each other.
I've written that.
They do. Yeah. They do. And all patriarchal religions have been maintained and upheld by women.
To be fair,
it's not women. It's not men deciding to go to church on a Sunday. It's women, because the whole system is set up to benefit.
Women are more traditionally concerned about social standards.
Yeah.
The only people who shouted at
nuance.
me to put on a face mask during COVID were the ladies.
It is disturbing because, of course, Iran didn't used to have this. We all see those pictures from the 70s or whatever it is when they're just like, it looks like a Western country.
Yeah.
So it is quite disturbing, especially to have other people snitching and enforcing. That's what I don't like.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
Our job is to do what's in the best interest of our country.
You made my argument for me.
My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
I'm hearing it up and down the country. That was a beginning, not an end.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, for those that don't know, D-Day was just the most extraordinary military operation ever. And if you haven't been to Normandy and viewed the beaches and then indeed what happened inland with gigantic tank battles and breakouts, it really was the most dramatic and vital campaign, because it was the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. As I mentioned earlier, 2 American beaches, 1 Canadian beach and 2 British beaches. And we shouldn't forget that, because actually the truth of it is, when the English-speaking peoples of the world get together, they can do some truly remarkable things. And you think about those people who came from Canada, America, you know, in many ways what happened in Europe wasn't directly their concern. You could argue that it wasn't directly our concern. But it's funny, isn't it? Both times we went to war to save not just our democracy, but that of the rest of Europe too. So it was an incredible operation, you know, starting through the small hours with gliders, with parachutists going in at 3 a.m. And the film, the 1970 film, The Longest Day, if you haven't seen it, is really rather good. But clearly, as the generation that took part in the landings and in all the preparations for it, clearly that generation are, how can I put it, thinning out ever so slightly. So it's not that easy around a Sunday lunch table to have conversations about these things. And it would appear that it's beginning to slip from memory. Now, Charlie Peters of GB News spoke earlier on to Simon Bendry, head of education at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and this happened at Botley in Oxford. And, you know, he asked the question, you know, are people really aware of this anniversary and why it matters?
I think there's always that fear as sort of generations pass that once those with living memory have gone, that there is that loss of interest. But I think what I found working in education for the last 10 years is that in any school that you go in, there are young people who are interested in these events, who are inspired by these events, that there are a coming generation who are engaged and interested by this. But that's a key part of the role that I undertake for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, is creating programmes that enable us to get out into schools, but also encourage schools to come and visit our sites, such as this one here in Botley.
So education is very important. And I wonder, we talked earlier on at the top of the show about what was appropriate to teach youngsters about sex education, about relationships. Well, equally, I think it's a very valid question. What's it right to teach our youngsters about British history? And particularly relatively contemporary British history. Well, after talking to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, Charlie Peters went out and about in Botley to ask locals whether they knew what D-Day even was.
I think it's really brave what they managed to do all those years ago. It's absolutely amazing, and I definitely think it's worth celebrating because they did so much for us. The least we can do is have one day for them.
D-Day, that's like the end of World War II, isn't it? 1944. That's like the end of World War II. I don't really know much about it. I used to know a bit, but not anymore.
the end of the war.
That's VE Day.
I don't know then.
It's the 80th anniversary next month. It was when the Allies landed at Normandy.
Okay.
Do you know what D-Day is?
No. No.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. So it's clear that some of the younger generation literally haven't got a clue. And it's not necessarily their fault, because, as I say, that generation have passed on. And they're not being taught this at schools. And it's all wrong, in my view. Well, someone who takes a great interest in military history, especially aviation history, is my friend Leo McKinstry, amongst journalism. And Leo, you've written books about fighters and bombers and all the rest of it. And just to get to D-Day, from your perspective, we think about the troops landing on the beach. We think about the up to 5,000 craft that were engaged in the operation. But, of course, the Royal Air Force, in the run-up to and during the campaign for Normandy, were also incredibly active, weren't they?
That's very true, Nigel. Thanks for having me on, and good evening. Yes, as you mentioned, I have written a lot of books about the RAF during the war, and there are two crucial aspects of the RAF's role in 1944. One was carried out mainly by the Lancasters and Halifax as a bomber command, and they smashed the transport network, the railway network in northern France, so the Germans couldn't bring up troops to be near the beaches. And that was called Operation Point Blank, and it was a great success, and it immobilized a lot of the German forces. And the second one was Coastal Command, which doesn't get the credit it deserves, but it was a crucial part of the RAF in the Battle of the Atlantic. And then in 1944, the task of stopping the U-boats, the deadly German U-boats reaching the English Channel, and the British and American and Allied invasion force. Because the deadly German U-boats would have caused mayhem if they'd got amongst the vessels of the D-Day landings. So the Coastal Command performed their duties superbly, and not a single U-boat got near any of the invasion force in the first D-Day, and the 8 days after that, it was a tremendous success. And Churchill wrote,
yeah, that's a point that never gets talked about, Leo. And I think it's very interesting that you said that. And also the Spitfires and the Hurricanes that were flying over the beaches, they also had a different marking, didn't they, put on the underwing just for Normandy.
So they weren't fired at by their own side. They had the black and white stripes, so that all aircraft in the Allied invasion force have those stripes under their wings, so that they would identify. They could be identified against and be fired at by their own side.
And it's very distinct. Now, we're told today that French kids know more than British kids about D-Day. Well, that doesn't, as such, surprise me. But when you saw that clip earlier of those youngsters up just on the outskirts of Oxford who know nothing about this whatsoever, I mean, something fundamentally is going wrong, isn't it, in the way we're teaching kids history?
Absolutely. I found that very depressing, given, as you said, the sheer scale of the operation. It was the greatest invasion in history, the greatest amphibious operation in history, and it changed the whole destiny of Europe and the world, and it brought an end to the foulest tyranny mankind's ever seen. So it's incredibly important, and it's depressing that so many young people don't seem to know about it. And I think that it does reflect that both how badly history is taught in some of our schools, and also this lack of patriotism. That patriotism is regarded with such suspicion now. It's seen as a dangerous, as you know from your own great career.
I do. I do. I know.
Device of reactionary force, when actually D-Day shows the sacrifices by all those Americans, Canadians, and British men on the beaches, shows that it's an ennobling force. They were sacrificing their own lives for the noble ideal of freedom and the end of German tyranny.
Leo, thank you ever so much for joining us and giving us a different perspective there on D-Day, because we always think about the Navy, we think about the Army, but the RAF perspective, Coastal Command, very important. And if you go to Gold Beach, you'll still see what's left of the Mulberry Harbour that we built, and that was where we could drive tanks off ships and directly onto land, and it's still there. The Americans built one at Utah Beach, and we told them the specs weren't right. And there was a gale in July 1944, and their Mulberry Harbour disappeared in 1944, and ours is still there. But I'm not being anti-American about this, but it is simply a fact. Tomorrow night, we'll have a World War II veteran here in the studio with us. I am joined in the studio by Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, I think I'm going to come and have a chat with you tonight, aren't I?
It's going to be one of the hardest interviews I think I've ever done. The most testing interview subject, the one and only Nigel Farage, yes.
Well, good stuff. What Leo had to say there about Coastal Command monitoring and keeping the U-boats away, well, wasn't that interesting?
Wasn't that interesting?
I'd never thought of that aspect.
I hadn't thought of that, and I recently read a book called Hitler's Ungentlemanly War and all the sabotage behind the lines that stopped the German military getting there. It's fascinating.
Fascinating. We're the first with Alex Deacon.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Evening, welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Sunny spells for many tomorrow, but there will be some heavy showers across the south. Yet again, northern Scotland may well see the highest temperatures. Low pressure dominating down to the southwest, and this weather front's provided a thicker zone of cloud across central areas. That rain from that weather front, though, is tending to peter out, as are the heavier showers we saw earlier. Just a bit of rain just returning to parts of the east coast as we go through the night. For many, it'll be a dry night, quite murky and misty on the eastern coast, and some fog is possible across parts of the south as temperatures generally drop to about 10 to 12 Celsius. Any mist and fog in the south should be clearing away, so generally out of the way by the time we get to the morning rush hour. But quite a lot of cloud across East Anglia and parts of the southeast, where there may well be one or two showers, some of that rain feeding into Lincolnshire as well. Generally a fine start for Wales, most of Northern Ireland as well, and a good part of Scotland. Again, dry and fine with sunny spells. The breeze coming in from the North Sea, so the east coast will be chilly, but again, northern Scotland in the sunshine, we'll see those temperatures really jumping up through the course of the day. It's going to stay fairly dull and cool, though, in northeast England. Some outbreaks of rain here, and we'll see a bit more rain coming into East Anglia, Lincolnshire, then across the Midlands during the afternoon. The potential for some quite heavy showers breaking out across the Midlands, southern England and South Wales. Some torrential downpours are possible. In the brighter spells in the south, 20 degrees, but the highest temperature is likely to be across parts of Scotland. In the northwest, 23, 24 is possible. Cooler on the North Sea coast with that breeze coming in, which is still around on Friday. Again, turning things misty at times. Again, on Friday, we'll watch the showers developing across parts of England and Wales especially. Again, some heavy ones are possible, but they'll be very hit and miss. A good part of the day will be dry and bright, and in the sunny spells, it'll feel pretty warm once more. Bye for now.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
You really could be our next big winner with an incredible £20,000 in tax-free cash to play with this summer. What would you spend that on? Well, whilst you're thinking about it, listen to some of our previous winners getting that winning phone call from us.
I'm Charles. I'm on £18,000 cash. It was just amazing, and as soon as it goes into your bank account, it just changed. It's a life-changing thing. Just go for it. It's an absolute must. You must try and go for it.
The next winning call could be answered by you. For another chance to win £20,000 in tax-free cash, text PRIZE to 63232. Text costs £2.